In 2000, China was selling roughly 2 million cars a year. By 2007, it was selling 18 million cars a year. You see this with TSMC. The US is giving huge subsidies to TSMC to move their fabs to the US, and TSMC keeps saying we can't find the workers.
Yeah.
One of the jokes we tell each other in Asia is that the tragedy of Asia is that Japan's a profoundly socialist country on which capitalism was imposed, and China's a profoundly capitalist country
Yes.
on which socialism was imposed.
Yeah, I agree.
And that both are drifting back to their natural order of things.
Yeah.
A lot of people, thanks to the biased Western media, have been led to believe that China's economy is on the verge of collapse and that the country is in deep crisis. But is that actually the case? Famous economist Louis-Vincent Gave breaks it all down in this video, explaining why China's economy might just overtake the US in the near future.
So let me ask you something that's been puzzling me for a long time. So when you compare the size of the PRC economy and the US economy, there are two commonly used ways of doing it. One is PPP adjusted. The other one is nominal based on exchange rates. But I've always thought that even the nominal so the PPP thing, let's not get into that right now, but the nominal thing, I've always understood that the way the Chinese government reports what it categorizes toward the nominal GDP number is qualitatively different from the way the US does it. So in other words, services provided by the state, which people don't pay for, are not included in that number, even though it is a form of economic activity for the country. Maybe you could just comment on how you think about the relative size of the two economies.
So we could go down this rabbit hole, and that'd be a 3-hour conversation. There's so many branches we can go down, but to try to narrow it down, let's stick to nominal GDP. Forget the purchasing parity adjustment, because that opens up different cans of worms as well. Stick to nominal GDP. If we stick to nominal GDP, the U.S. economy is still about a third bigger than the Chinese economy. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Is, if you think of the GDP as having, primary sort of agriculture and mining, manufacturing industry, etc. So secondary sector, and then your tertiary sector being your services industry. So if you break it down this way, even though the Chinese economy is a third smaller than the US, industry, your secondary sector, is 60% bigger than than the US. So Chinese today, manufacturing and industry in China is 60% bigger than the US already. And that gap is growing for all the reasons we highlighted, the STEM kids, the fact that industry is an ecosystem. I mean, you're from Michigan. I don't need to tell you this, right? You got one factory, and it's here because it's next to the other factory that does this, which is next to the other factory that does that, and they all feed into each other. And like once you manage to get that ecosystem going, it can grow quite fast, and it grows on itself. And if you don't have that ecosystem, now the other thing about manufacturing, of course, is you need the engineers, you need the STEM kids, and you need the workers who are trained to be workers in an industry that trains the next set of workers, right? Like the 40-year-old trains the 20-year-old who comes in and who passes on skill. And to some extent, this is what the U.S. has lost, right? In the deindustrialization, so that's not that easy to replicate. You see this with TSMC. The U.S. is giving huge subsidies to TSMC to move their fabs to the US, and TSMC keeps saying we can't find the workers.
Yeah,
like we literally can't find the guys who
my wife's family's from
Taiwan.
My wife's family's from Taiwan, so I hear all the inside stuff about how frustrated these Taiwanese companies are trying to get American workers to perform the way that people are used to performing, in Taiwan.
Well, Foxconn's another example, right? I remember when Trump got elected, Foxconn said, "Oh, we're going to open
Wisconsin,
a big plant in Wisconsin. We're going to open one in Indiana." 5 years later, there's nada.
Right. So I think
they could, but
I think
they couldn't get the workers.
I think you're emphasizing that as far as manufacturing and doing physical things, the Chinese economy is really qualitatively like almost 2x in some sense larger than the US. But What I'm
so I was going to come to that point. So now you come to the services.
Yeah.
You come to the services industry, and the Chinese economy is like 20% of the U.S. economy. So the service industry in China is, when you look through the GDP numbers. Now you could say the service industry in the U.S. is disproportionately big, because it's, as a European coming to the U.S., it's always dumbfounding how great the U.S. is at commercializing things. You go to you go to an American football game where you're mentioning sports. You can't turn around without being offered something to buy, without being made to spend money, in a way that doesn't happen in a European stadium. So the service industry in the U.S. is so great at at pushing things on the consumer, etc. It's the financial industry is obviously a really big part of GDP. The healthcare industry is a really big part of GDP. All of which we don't really have in China. So the service industry in China. So on the one hand, you could say, oh, the U.S. service industry is too big, but it seems to work for the U.S. So who's to say that it's too big?
Can I ask you about that, though? Because it seems like in terms of consumer purchasing, the efficiency of, if I want to buy something and get it delivered to my house, or I want to shop efficiently and find the right air conditioner for my apartment that fits my window, it doesn't seem like the consumer has any less efficiency or range of choice in China than in the U.S. So
that part is good.
Yeah.
No, that part is good in China. You can, you go on Taobao, you find anything you want, it gets delivered. The e-commerce, in fact, China is the one country outside of the U.S. that has built a proper internet/tech ecosystem.
Right.
It's really, you would think India would have it, given that they have so many engineers.
Right.
But the back-end infrastructure in India isn't that great, right? The roads, the logistics, etc.
So to account for this fact that I think you said that if you just look at the service sector, it's China's service sector by this kind of standard,
it's minuscule.
20% of the U.S. Yet it seems like any kind of transaction that I actually want to involve myself in China, whether it's trading stock or buying an air conditioner or a car, it seems like it's just as developed and just as efficient as what we have in the U.S. So what is that 5-to-1 ratio there that you're talking about?
So I think first it's a poorer country. And I don't know if you're familiar, I could send you pieces on this. There was a French economist called Aftalion who talked about the acceleration phenomena. And the idea is income is distributed along a bell-shaped curve, right? Typically in a country. So, if in China the average income is $10,000, almost everybody makes between 5 and 15. You'll have a small tail of people who make less than 5 and a small tail of people who make more than 15. Now, the reason this matters is there's thresholds for consumption. Mm-hmm. So at $2,000, everybody buys a smartphone. At $1,000, everybody buys a TV. $2,000, everybody buys a smartphone. $10,000, they buy a car. And the more, everything below 15 is all about goods. Everything post 15 is all about services. Once you start making more than $15,000, you spend more money on education. You spend more money on healthcare. You spend more money on financial services. You start buying mutual funds or open a brokerage account. Now, again, so you think of your bell-shaped curve. What's happening in China today is that everybody is in that consumption still bucket of things. So to your point, I make a little more money, I'm going to buy an air conditioner. I make a little more money, I'm going to buy a microwave, or I'm going to buy a car. And by the way, that curve, this is why it's the acceleration phenomena. As it moves to the right, as incomes grow over time, the area that, China was a great example for this. In 2000, China was selling roughly 2 million cars a year. By 2007, it was selling 18 million cars a year, because the curve had shifted where the area of people earning $10,000. So all of a sudden, it doesn't, if the curve shifts 20% to the right, your demand for cars doesn't go up 20%. It goes up 7x. So, a lot of the services the Americans spend money on, again, healthcare, finance, education, which, by the way, are really big bills in the U.S. I don't need to tell you the cost of a U.S. education,
yes,
nor the cost of U.S. healthcare. Things that in China are essentially free. Now, you could say they're not free for everybody, the government has to pay some of it, etc. But to your point, that doesn't really get reflected really well in the national statistics.
So that was the point someone had made to me specifically, that if you're getting your healthcare kind of free from, or quasi free from, the government system, when they report numbers that would otherwise be folded into GDP as, the healthcare that I personally purchase in the US, that number is just absent in the accounting, even though there is a doctor providing that service to the person in China. And similarly, go ahead. Similarly with education.
And if you look, I think if you look at the US, healthcare is what? It's now 18% of US GDP or something. I'm quoting from memory, but it's a big number. So if instead of an 18, you've got a 2.
Right.
And education, if instead of a
and the college going percentage, so the percentage of high school graduates who leave high school and go to college in China is now about 60%. So it's similar to the US level. So it doesn't seem like they're actually lacking educational services in China, but somehow the accounting makes it such that it appears that part of their economy is much, much smaller than in the United States. So that somebody made this point to me, and I was just curious whether how big is that distortion in the comparison?
Oh, it's definitely a big one. And your US college student pays $50,000 a year, $60,000 a year. Your Chinese college student pays
2,000 or something.
To be honest, no, like 2,000 renminbi. It's a rounding error. And so so you are in essence comparing apples and oranges, but there is also the element of, as China, as incomes continue to grow. Now, granted, they might not be growing as fast as they did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but they are still growing. So as incomes grow, you are still going to see more money being spent in tourism, more money being spent on entertainment, more money being spent on education, on healthcare. Because yes, you can go to the public healthcare, but the reality is, rich people don't want to do that. They now want, no, but it's true. Like if you have a chance to go to a private clinic, you're going to pick that over the
it's fair,
healthcare.
totally fair.
And so money starts to get spent there. For now, it's a small minority of people, but in 5 years' time, that number will be up 5x, 10x, and so I highlight this because this is also China's challenge. We talked earlier how China's graduating. It's going to be graduating 12.3 million kids this year, 11.7 last year. These are kids who want jobs, in an air-conditioned office with a phone and a laptop. They don't want to be, pouring concrete or beating pavements with a sledgehammer. And the problem for the government is it's not like there's 12 million guys working in the service industry in China today that are going to be retiring at the end of this year to make room for the 12 million kids coming in. So, if you look at the government 20 years ago, the challenge was you had 20 million guys leave the farm for the city every year. Guys and girls leave the cities for the cities every year, leave the farm for the cities. And so what they did with these guys is say, okay, well, we need to build a road here, and we need to build a power plant here, and a subway line over there. Now, transforming a farmer into a bricklayer, that's actually not that hard, right?
Yep.
It's, but now technically what you'd want is somebody to say, okay, we need an insurance company here, and a sports marketing business there, and a private hospital here. But the government can't really do that. Right? It's not like the government can say, "Oh, let's build a sports marketing business here." That just doesn't work.
Yep.
That's got to come from the bottom up. And here, the only thing the government can do is create the right conditions for that to occur. But it'll need to happen because if you're going to graduate 12 million kids a year, you need to find jobs for them.
Yeah. My guess is that this reported very high youth unemployment number is just because so many kids go to college now in China. It was such a rapid transition from very few going to, 60% of the kids going to college. Now, all of those kids expect to have white collar, knowledge worker type jobs, and there just aren't that many available in the economy for them right now. So some of them are going to have to just bite the bullet and do something which is a little bit less glamorous than what they thought they were going to college for.
So there's that, but also remember that all these kids are the fruits of 2 generations of one-child policy.
Yep.
So So they have 4 grandparents, 2 parents, no cousins, no brothers and sisters. So they actually also have the option of staying at home, and a lot of them do. Like of waiting for the right job.
Yep.
Because, if you have 5 kids, you tell the kids you're not staying at home.
Yeah.
You kids are out of here.
Yep.
Go make your way, which was always the way in China, by the way, right? And that's why, for years all these guys were leaving the farm, because if you were one of 5 kids on a farm, if you divide the land 5 ways, you're left with, not a lot of land. It's not economical. And so, for years and years and years, people in China really had no choice but to leave. Sometimes they left for the Chinese cities, but sometimes they left much further afield. They went all across Southeast Asia, to the Americas, to to Australia. There really wasn't much choice, but now there is actually. There is no sort of gun to their head. Like they can stay at home,
Yep.
and a lot of them do.
So this is something that is going to have to work itself through the system, and it may take some period of time, really, for the labor markets to equilibrate properly.
So did you ever read a book came out just after the 2008 crisis called Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell?
Sure. Yeah.
It was it was a fun read. And one of the points he makes, he looks at the, odd things that occur, like, how all the hockey players are born in November and December, and how all the tech guys, you take Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Scott McNealy, Paul Allen, Steve Wozniak, like all of them, like this sort of the first wave of the big tech founders, the guys who did Microsoft, Apple, Sun Microsystem, Oracle, all these guys were all born within 12 months of each other.
Mm-hmm.
And the point Malcolm Gladwell makes is, look, it was basically the first PC sort of came out when these guys were 20 years old. And so if you were like already 25 or 28, chances are you were married. And so you stayed at your job at IBM or at General Electric or wherever. And, these guys, they fiddle around with the computer, et cetera. But I actually think Gladwell missed the bigger point, because I think if you were 24, 25, you still weren't married. The bigger point was that all these guys were also college dropouts,
Mm-hmm.
like literally, like almost all of them,
Mm-hmm.
Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, et cetera. And they were in college. They dropped out in 74, 75 when the U.S. was going through a terrible, really bad recession.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when I went to college, I went to Duke, and, the deal was pretty simple. You keep your head down, you do your work, you get good grades, then maybe you get recruited by Morgan Stanley or by McKinsey or by Goldman Sachs, and then, you work hard while you're there, and then at the end of it all, you'll have the Hamptons house and,
Yep.
and the sports car. If you keep your head down and just do well, there was no real reason to really go out of your way.
Take risk.
You take risks. Like, why would you, right? This
Yep.
is like, if I just stay in the rails, everything's good. But in 74, 75, that wasn't an option. If you were at Harvard in 74, 75, you'd like, well, what the hell? Like, I'm going to stay here. There's no job with IBM at the end of this, and there's no job with GE at the end of this. So I might as well try my thing. And so I think that's what's going to happen in China.
So you see a lot of entrepreneurs coming out of this group of kids right now that are dealing with this high unemployment rate.
I think you will. One of the jokes we tell each other in Asia is that the tragedy of Asia is that Japan's a profoundly socialist country on which capitalism was imposed, and China's a profoundly capitalist country
Yes.
on which socialism was imposed.
Yeah, I agree.
And that both are drifting back to their natural order of things.
Yeah.
And if you've spent time in Japan or China, it rings true. It rings true. Like, China is a profoundly capitalist place.
I agree with you 100%.
and-
The Japanese are much more collectivistic than the Chinese,
Yeah.
and even more orderly and rule obeying. And the Chinese are much more more likely to be natural entrepreneurs than Japanese, actually.
Yeah. And by the way, look at historically. We mentioned how through the 19th and 20th century, a lot of Chinese people had no choice but to export themselves. They ended up running all the businesses in Southeast Asia. Like, you go to Indonesia, you go to Thailand, you go to Vietnam, like all the business, like, leaders, empires, etc. It was all Chinese.
Yep.
Like, China is a deeply entrepreneurial culture. The Chinese culture is a deeply entrepreneurial culture.
Yep.